In this video, I'm going to be tier ranking all 38 of the writing advice books that I've read over the years. For each book, I'll also provide a lightning fast summary of the key lessons and takeaways that I learned, and hopefully by the end of this exercise, I will have figured out which one of these 38 books is my absolute favorite. By the way, if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Jed. I'm the author of 3 fantasy books and a best-selling video game. Now, I should mention that before I get into ranking these books, this is all totally my own subjective preference. If I say that one of these books wasn't that useful for helping me write better novels, then that might just be me. But it might still be useful for you in the development of your writing skills. Let's get to it. So the very first book on this list is Structuring Your Novel by K.M. Weiland. And when I read this, this was quite a revelation to me because at the time, I just sort of thought that writers sat down and they just wrote on the page and that there was no planning and there was no structure or outlining or anything like that that went into the process of writing. I thought that creativity and structure were these opposed forces. But this book helped me realize that there are actually ways to structure your story that don't diminish your enjoyment from writing it. And if anything, the process of actually structuring your novels effectively can make you more excited to write the story because it just feels like it's hitting those emotional beats in a more compelling way. So because of that, I would put that into the must-read category there. It was hugely pivotal for my development as a writer. Next, we have Your First Million Words, which is a memoir/writing advice book from fantasy author Jeff Wheeler. Now, Jeff Wheeler, massively successful author by all accounts. I haven't actually personally read any of his books, so I can't quite remember how I picked up his memoir, but it was a good memoir. It's always lovely to read about the different adventures and stories that, different creators go on with their own writing journeys. But honestly, I can't really take any tangible lessons from this book. It was something I read a while ago and I don't really remember it that well. So because of that, I'm unfortunately gonna have to put it on the C tier there. I think if I had actually read some of his books beforehand, this would be something that was quite useful. And again, this doesn't diminish his ability as an author or anything like that. By all accounts, he seems to be a good writer from what I've heard, but just didn't resonate with me in a massive way. Next, we have 5,000 Words Per Hour by Chris Fox, and this is basically a guide to writing faster. It has a little bit of a clickbaity title. I have not personally hit the 5,000 words per hour mark, but this book has been really useful for helping me write a lot faster. Probably the most useful takeaway from this book here is the idea of just focusing on your writing sessions as a sprint and trying to be working at full intensity within your writing. And by doing that, Chris says, it's possible to get more done in a 10-minute burst of really focused writing than you could in an hour of sort of half-heartedly writing and then half checking the internet, just wasting your time and not being fully intense. And I remember when I read this, this actually had a really beneficial impact on my writing speed and helped me write a lot faster. So because of that, I'm gonna put that in A in the must-read category there, because just being able to improve your writing speed is really, really useful as an author. Next, we have The Game Maker's Apprentice. So this is a bit of a weird one, but back when I was 12 through to about 15, I was obsessed with using this software called Game Maker to develop my own video games. And I would build these games. They were just usually little silly platforming games, never really things with that much of a story to them. And I would bring them into school, I would play them with my friends. Sometimes they would get around onto other friends' computers and I'd have vague memories of seeing my games getting played by people I didn't even know sometimes, which was probably what really sparked my bug to write later on. Just that sense that you can create something and then it can kind of take on its own life out in the world. And The Game Maker's Apprentice is basically just a tutorial book for using this software. I don't even know if the software still exists or not, but it was really cool to just learn how to make games on this thing. So I'm gonna put that as an A up there. And even though this is the first book in the Game Maker sort of manual series, if you wanna call it that, I actually read the second book first, which is The Game Maker's Companion. And this was massive for me because this book actually has one of the best explanations of the hero's journey and of how you can bring plot into your games to make them more interesting. I remember at the time reading that and being like, oh, this is a structure that a lot of my favorite movies and books are following. And I was like 12 or 13 when I was reading this at the time. So I kind of forgot about it for a few years until I came back and sort of went into my writing and learned about how to structure my novels. But I'm actually gonna put this up here in the S tier because, like I said, from the ages of about 12 to 15, I was really into building these little video games. I probably made like 8 or 10 different games over that period. Then I moved on to writing and I fell in love with that. But a couple of years ago, I actually started a process of writing a video game for myself, which went on to become Siege of Trebelin. And this is a video game I wrote about defending a medieval city that is under siege, and it's done really well. It's probably been the most successful book/writing project that I've ever done. And it was just really cool to be able to come back to writing and producing a video game, even though this one is just purely text-based, and merging these two passions that I had of video games and writing. And I definitely would love to actually do more involved video games in the future at some point. So because of that, it goes up in the S tier. Next, we have 2,000 to 10,000 words per day by Rachel Aaron, which is very similar to Chris Fox's 5,000 words per hour. It's a book about improving your efficiency and speed as a writer. The most useful thing that I took away from this book was the fact that the more knowledge you have about what you're going to write, the faster you're going to write for that day. So one of the exercises that she talks about in there is how every day before you write, you should just take a couple of minutes to create a quick little brief for yourself, where you're basically just jotting down the bullet points of what's going to happen in your story that you're going to write today. And every time I do this, it really helps me write faster and higher quality as well. I'm honestly kind of debating between putting it into B versus A, because it felt to me like I remember more stuff from 5,000 words per hour, but this book is really useful too, and I kind of get them a bit confused sometimes, to be honest. So I'm gonna put this up here as well. Next, we have The Emotional Craft of Fiction by Donald Maass, who is actually a very successful literary agent, has represented a lot of my favorite authors. And this is what it says on the cover. It's a book about how to infuse your stories with emotional resonance and depth. Probably the most interesting thing about this book is it made me realize that all of my favorite stories have the same kind of core emotional moment, which typically tends to come around about 80% of the way through the narrative if you really want to get nerdy with it. And what I'm talking about here is the moment in something like Lord of the Rings, where the beacons get lit, or when Harry Potter duels Voldemort for the last time as the sun rises over Hogwarts, or in Avengers Endgame when the portals appear and all of the Avengers kind of come out to fight Thanos. And in all of those moments, there's this sort of really grand, emotional, sweeping moment that always just kind of makes the hairs stand up along my arms and gives me these goosebumps almost. And there's just something so transcendent and so incredible about those feelings. And in this book, he actually kind of explained what's going on there. And specifically, he's talking about how these scenes are so powerful because they take us from utter despair to hope. To quote from the book, Maass has this idea he's talking about where he's talking about how to sort of infuse stories with this sense of emotional richness. And he describes how that irresistible, invisible current is a feeling, one that readers can only sense and for which they do not have a name. What causes them to experience this feeling is not so much anything you put into your story, as it is a spirit that underlies it, a spirit that you bring, and that spirit is hope. And I just really love the exercises that he goes through in this book for sort of infusing your story with more emotional depth and resonance. And I think he really speaks to why I find stories powerful, because they can really give us hope in some of the darkest moments of our lives, because they're showing characters who are going through these immense struggles and these immense difficulties, and yet they still find a way to triumph despite all of that. So that goes up in the S tier as well. Next, we have Character by Robert McKee, and this is a guide to creating really compelling and complex characters. Probably the most useful exercise from this book is the idea of just asking yourself, what are my characters doing outside of the plot? So he goes through a really good exercise there where he's like, let's say you have this female detective character, and most of the story is just about her investigating this case, but ask yourself, what does she do in between cases? Like, what does she do on a regular Sunday? Like, what does she do if there's no work to be done on a Tuesday? Like, where is she going? Is she going down to the beach? Is she going to yoga? Is she like catching up with friends? Is she going to a library and reading books? Follow your characters around outside of the story and you'll discover a lot more about them. This is actually an exercise I went through with one of my coaching clients recently in my story coaching program, where he had a character in his story and we were sort of both discussing him. And we were like, it feels like there's just not that sense of depth here. And I asked him a few probing questions about, what was this guy's upbringing? Why does he act the way that he acts? Like, what are the things sort of motivating him? Tell me what he is like when he is not just serving functions in this story. And it led to my client coming up with a really, really interesting backstory for this character that, in my mind, improved this character by like 2 or 3 times just through a really small, simple tweak. And that's honestly one of the biggest things I'm finding in my story coaching program, which is basically where I work one-on-one with writers to help them improve their books. From what I found, there's sort of these 8 key principles behind being a successful author. And those principles, in my mind, are plot, character, setting, dialogue, prose, emotion and suspense, habits and mindset, and then last of all, marketing. And the problem is not being able to fully understand or fully execute properly in one of these 8 principles creates a bottleneck for your writing as a whole. So, the inability to understand what's going on with your prose, or not quite knowing how to get your dialogue working effectively, that is a bottleneck that is going to ruin the overall story, no matter how good the other aspects are. And what I found with coaching clients through this program is it's really simple to actually fix a lot of these bottlenecks. And a lot of writers have a tremendous amount of talent, and it's just one or two little things like this that are maybe blind spots for them. But when you can tweak those and figure out how to move past those blockages, all of a sudden the story will just begin to flow better, and you feel like you've really leveled up a lot as a writer. At the moment, I do only have like 1 or 2 more slots left in my story coaching program, but if you are interested in applying to work with me one-on-one to improve your writing, to help you fix these bottlenecks and create a better story, then just use the link in the description down below to apply. And if we're a good fit, we'll get on a call to discuss further details about your writing and the program. So back to character specifically, I would probably say this is in the must-read category here. I think that exercise I was talking about, following your character around outside of your story, is really useful, and it's just one of the many exercises that's in this book. Next, we have Outlining Your Novel by K.M. Weiland, and this was definitely life-changing for me. That's like an easy S-tier novel, because this is the thing that helped me go from writing my very first book and struggling with the structure of it, not quite understanding how the story thing worked. And then I read Outlining Your Novel, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, that's what I need to do. I need to outline my book. I need to figure out how to match my character's internal journey to the sort of external journey of the plot. And outlining is now something that I do before I start every project, and it's so important for just giving me that bird's eye view of my story so that I can know at a glance, like, is this thing working? And while my approach has definitely evolved from this book here, I think that Outlining Your Novel was just really pivotal for sort of getting me into outlining, and it's a very good primer for developing outlines, especially if you're someone who has never really experimented with it before. Next, we have Writing and Releasing Rapidly by Elana Johnson, and this is a book about just how to be more productive and how to get more books out quickly. I think that there are useful things in this book, but in some senses it does feel like it could have been a little bit more condensed down to something like a blog post, so I'm going to put it in all right there. I think it is amazing when authors figure out how to publish, 3, 4, 5 books a year. That's not a stage that I'm at the moment. I mean, my most recent projects, Kingdom of Dragons, that's 170,000 words. That's like almost 800 pages. Before that, Siege of Trebelin, 280,000 words. I tend to write long stuff these days, which sort of precludes me a little bit from this rapid releasing model. But at some point in the future, perhaps I might get back into writing more shorter stuff, which is more sort of optimized for releasing on a more rapid schedule. Next, we have The Emotion Thesaurus. This is a really interesting book, which basically goes through, I think, like 100 different emotions or whatever. And for each emotion, it gives you different ways that you can describe it. Probably the most useful aspect is it gives you different internal sensations. So for example, for anger, it tells you what the body actually does physically when you are experiencing anger. So this is really useful if you're starting out as a writer and you feel like you're quite repetitive with your emotional descriptions. This is something that I've definitely noticed in working with clients in my story coaching program. Often they have a very limited emotional description vocabulary. There's only maybe 4 or 5 emotions that they can sort of describe. And so that's why I've actually bought this book for at least one of my clients, maybe more, I can't remember. But essentially this book, I think, is a very useful primer, but I'm probably gonna put it in the all right category here, just because it's not something that has, I think, really had a massive dramatic change for my writing. It's something that is good for enhancing your writing by like a 5 or 10% mark. Next, we have Story by Robert McKee, which is in some senses almost like the writing advice book. This thing came out in 1997. A lot of the other stuff on this list here, I feel like really owes a lot of its depth to this book. In particular, a lot of K.M. Weiland stuff, which I read before reading Story. You can see how it draws from this book. And obviously she has her own interpretation and her stuff is great as well. Structuring a novel, outlining a novel, that sort of thing, really good. But Story feels like it's almost the origin point for a lot of writing advice books out there. So that's a definite S for me. And it probably goes, I really should reorganize the things up here. If I was to reorganize the things here, what would I go? Game Maker's Companion is good, but I would probably put it down on the lower end here. It would probably be like Story at the top, outlining your novel, then Emotional Craft at the top there, just to clean that up. And in Story, probably the most useful lesson I learned from that is the idea of a complex character, and specifically what it means to create dimension within your character. So sometimes we say one-dimensional character or three-dimensional character, and 3 dimensions is good. But as Robert McKee says in this book, a dimension is just when you have a line of contradiction within a character. So if you take someone like the Terminator, he is both robot and man. That is one dimension of complication. And if you were to add 2 or 3 other things in there, he would become more dimensional. So for example, he's robot and he's a man, that's one dimension. He is extremely serious, but then at times he's quite funny, that's another dimension. So now we've taken him from a one-dimensional character to a 2-dimensional character, and you can see how you can keep adding these different layers to create someone who feels complex and compelling and interesting to follow. Next, we have dialogue by Robert McKee again. You can see I'm a bit of a Robert McKee fanboy here. This is in that must-read category as well. Probably the most useful thing I learned from this book is the idea of dialogue as verbal action. Dialogue is not just, random words that characters are saying. Dialogue is a way that characters attempt to achieve their desires. And that framework just really unlocks dialogue for me. It makes it far more vivid and exciting to write. Next, we have Mastering Simple Ads by Mark Dawson. Mark Dawson is a best-selling author. He's got some writing advice podcasts out there and that sort of thing as well. This feels almost unfair to do, but I am going to have to put it in the D category down here, purely just because it didn't really work for me. And maybe that's just because I wasn't very good at figuring out how to use Facebook ads to sell my books. Maybe my genre wasn't as good as the examples he was using in the book, but for whatever reason, it just didn't really work for me. And that is maybe not a reflection of the quality of this book. Perhaps Facebook ads is something that is going to work for you. I know at least one other author who I'm friends with who has had some great results with Facebook ads and everything. So by no means am I ruling them out. But for me personally, I am much more interested in content marketing, in doing stuff like this YouTube channel where I'm actually giving out, beneficial advice to people and then growing a readership because of that as well, rather than just, spending money on paid advertising. I feel like paid advertising is something that in the long term is just not a great way to build a career as an author. Again, Mark Dawson, I think has sold a lot more books than I have. So, maybe I'm totally wrong there, but for whatever reason, just didn't really click with me. I would much prefer other approaches of marketing my book, so that's why it is down there. Next, we have Amazon Ads for Authors, which is written by Ricardo Fayet, who is the head of Readsy. Readsy is a really cool platform. It's very useful for formatting your book. I've used it to format a couple of books, and they have a lot of good tools on there as well. But again, I'm just gonna have to put it down in D here because as great as Readsy is, and Ricardo seems like a nice guy from everything I've seen, I just didn't really see that much success with Amazon ads personally. So again, it might work really well for you, but for me, it's just not been something that has been super beneficial to my writing. Next, we have Reader Magnets by Nick Stephenson. This is a book that definitely could have been a blog post, but it is a short ebook. It's, I think, like 20 pages or something like that. But essentially, this book is talking about how a really important aspect of being an author is having an email newsletter where you basically have a direct relationship with your readers. And in this book, he talks about how you should try to create like a free short story or a free novel that you give away to get people to sign up to your newsletter, which is great advice. It's something that I do. I have 3 short stories / novellas, which you can read for free in exchange for signing up to my newsletter. And as a result of that tactic, my newsletter has grown to, I think, over 2,000 readers at this point. So having reader magnets is very useful and it's very important to develop. So I'm going to put it I was thinking of putting it in all right. I feel like upon reflection, putting it in very good is useful, more so just for the concept of reader magnets. Like what I've described to you there is kind of the extent of the book, but still it's been a useful mental framework for me and it's been a useful marketing exercise. Next, we have The Anatomy of Story by John Truby, which is a book that I often reference on this channel. That is going up here in the S tier. I would probably put it right there, just after story and outlining your novel. So this is basically drawing from kind of philosophy and mythology to figure out how to create a structure for your story that is really driven by your character's moral and emotional development. And for me, the most useful aspect of this is the idea of the character web. So his theory is that in good stories, characters don't exist in isolation from each other. They all form part of a character web which explores the themes of your story from different angles and in a compelling, conflicted way. And for me, that was really useful because now when I'm developing characters, I am thinking about that. I'm thinking about how they all relate to each other, how they form this web. And his writing in this book about the idea of theme as well has been hugely influential to me as well. He has a very practical approach to theme that allows you to generate conflict and interesting moments in your story. Next, we have 5 Secrets of Story Structure by K.M. Weiland. I've talked here before about how I really like K.M. Weiland stuff, but honestly, I can't really remember what the 5 Secrets of Story Structure are here. This is kind of a free short ebook. It is basically a reader magnet for K.M. Weiland. I think you get it for free when you sign up to her newsletter. And look, her other stuff is great. I would just go structuring your novel instead of reading this personally. So I'm going to put it down here just because I can't really remember what was in there. But maybe if I reread it, I would change my mind. And then again, another one by K.M. Weiland here, creating character arcs. In my mind, this almost forms part of a trilogy with outlining your novel and structuring your novel. Those 3 books, creating character arcs, structuring your novel, outlining your novel, kind of feel like they're all exploring the same territory of how do you sequence the events in your story in a way that progresses your character and that creates progressive plot complications and explores your theme as well and just really excites readers. So I'm going to put this up in A, and I should probably clean this up as well. I would probably say this goes a little bit above structuring your novel for me, just because it does almost recap this book. So you can almost skip structuring your novel and go straight to character arcs, I would say. And then in terms of other stuff here, I would probably drag character up there. Game Maker can go down there. 2,000 words. Yeah, probably dialogue pretty high there as well. Next, we have Right to Market by Chris Fox. That's going to be an easy A must read up there. This is basically a book about how marketing is not something you can apply after a book is finished. You need to be thinking about who your readers are before you even start writing the book. And this is something I've talked about in other videos as well on this channel, but this was really pivotal in helping me understand why, say, my first book didn't sell that well. Fires of the Dead, really happy with it. People who've read it seem to super enjoy the kind of fast-paced nature of it, but it is a fantasy book that is like an epic fantasy book, but it is only 20,000 words long. So it's something you can read in, 2 to 3 hours. And like I said, I think it's entertaining and it's an engaging read because of that, but it's not exactly what most fantasy readers are looking for. Most fantasy readers are looking for that sense of immersion and depth. So Right to Market is basically about understanding how you can identify your niche and how you can present a book that appeals to them a lot so that your marketing feels quite easy after the fact. So next we have Newsletter Ninja by Tammi Labrecque, and this is just a really useful guide to setting up your author newsletter. Kind of covers similar territory to Reader Magnets as well, but is a lot more in-depth and shows you how you can use different welcome automations so that, say, when a reader signs up to your newsletter after downloading your free short story, you can then give them like an email once a week for 6 weeks where you basically explain more about who you are and what kind of books you write. Really, really useful, practical guide. I'd probably put that in the B category here as well. I think that's better than Reader Magnets. It goes a little bit more in depth. Next, we have Perennial Seller by one of my favorite nonfiction authors, Ryan Holiday. I would say it's probably not my favorite Ryan Holiday book, but it's definitely the one that is the most relevant to producing writing. And again, the lesson that he really touches on here is similar to the one in Right to Market, which is the idea that marketing cannot be applied to a product after the fact. Product has to be the marketing. So if you take something like the iPhone, for example, while they had amazing marketing campaigns for it, the intuitiveness of that actual product and how easy it was to use, that was really the marketing of it, and that's what led to word of mouth spreading. So the approach I like to think about with writing is, as an author, you should be aiming to produce a story that's so incredibly unique and interesting and good that readers can't help but tell all of their friends about this book. And through that word of mouth, that's how you actually get your stories to spread. So I'm gonna put that in the B category here, just because it's not 100% related to stories per se, but it is a very interesting look at how to make work that lasts. Next, we have Amazon Decoded by David Gaughran, who I know is a subscriber to this channel. So cheers for subscribing, David. Bit of a shout out there. David has some of the best guides to just working as an indie author and self-publishing. He's, I think, a really great trusted source of advice in this domain. And this book about Amazon is really, really useful because it sort of shows you how Amazon is this search system and how understanding that search system is really the key to figuring out how to get your book to appear to the right readers who are wanting to read it. So I'm gonna put that up here in A. Next, we have BookBub Ads Expert, also by David Gaughran. So this is basically about how to use BookBub, which is a sort of advertising platform to reach readers. It's not something I've experimented with a ton. It's probably a case of reading a book before it was relevant to me. So just because of that, I'm gonna put it in the B category here. But as with Amazon Decoded, you can really tell that he knows how this system works. So his guides are quite useful if you're specifically wanting to look at something like BookBub, for example. Next, we have On Being a Dictator by Kevin J. Anderson, who is a best-selling fantasy author who dictates most of his books. He says that basically he goes off on hikes for 5 or 6 hours and just dictates to himself in that whole period. So this was really interesting to me. It actually led to me experimenting with dictation for a little bit of the Thunder Heist. And I think a couple of the chapters towards the start of that book were actually written by dictation as I was just sort of walking around parks near my house. It's not something that I've really stuck with, but if I was to go more down the dictation route, I think I would revisit this book because it is a good guide for doing that. Next, we have Launch to Market by Chris Fox. So Right to Market was really good, which is why I picked up Launch to Market here. I feel like I can't remember as much of the stuff from Launch to Market as I did from Right to Market. And it does feel like it retreads a little bit of the same territory. It's still a good guide, but Right to Market is the one I would recommend out of those two books. So just because of that, I'm going to put it down in this category here. And then next we have James Patterson's autobiography. So this is a little bit of a weird one because I've actually never read a James Patterson book. And honestly, before I read his autobiography, I kind of thought he was, like a little bit of a hack because he does a lot of co-writing and he seems to pump out a tremendous volume of stuff. But after reading the book, I was actually found myself really liking the guy. Like, he quit a job that was very high paying and very lucrative in the advertising industry to pursue his creative dreams, which I found very inspiring. And he talks about the co-writing in there in a way that made me think that it's maybe not as bad as I was initially expecting. And of course, I just really love learning the stories about different writers out there and just seeing their progression. And I think that, whenever there's someone who has achieved, really great things within the world of writing, you should be trying to figure out how you can learn from that and apply useful lessons to your own life. So I'm gonna put that here. Next, we have The Art and Business of Online Writing by Nicholas Cole. This is mostly about like non-fiction writing and blogging and that sort of thing, but it's a really good primer for sort of what the modern world looks like in terms of writing and other forms of content. So I'm gonna put that in B category here just because it's not super relevant to writing, but there's a lot of great stuff in there about building your audience, about figuring out who you're writing for that is quite relevant for us authors. Next, Zen in the Art of Writing, which is Ray Bradbury's sort of collection of essays on the process of writing. This is such a joy to read. I remember when I came away from this thing just feeling so warm and enthusiastic about the process of writing. He really makes it feel like this magical special thing. So for that, it's a really, really good book and I would definitely recommend reading it. Quite short as well. And then on a similar topic, we have A Moveable Feast, which is Ernest Hemingway's memoir about his time when he was living in Paris in the 1920s and just developing and starting out as a writer. And his contemporaries and his friends he was hanging out with at the time included like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein and a lot of other interesting authors. So it's a super fascinating chronicle of a place, and it's also tinged with a certain bittersweetness to it as well, because he's writing this 30 years after the fact when it's 1950, he's in Cuba, and he's sort of reflecting back on his career, and a lot of the authors that he grew up with had sort of died. And it's just a very interesting book about life and art and writing, and I found it really, really powerful and quite evocative and moving. It's also the basis for one of my favorite movies ever, Midnight in Paris, which is where a writer in the modern day gets transported back to that 1920s Paris scene with Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and those other authors. So because of that, I'm going to put it up here in the A category. Next, we have The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. This is a book essentially about overcoming the resistance, which he personalizes as this almost like demonic force that is trying to stop you from getting your daily word counts in. Weirdly, when I first read this, it was like probably a 3 out of 5, and it was kind of like an all right or a meh, which was kind of underwhelming because I had heard so many great things about it. But over the years, this concept of just seeing the resistance as this tangible force that's really trying to stop you from your writing has become more and more interesting to me. And because of that, I would say it is in that B category where it is a very good read, and it's quite short as well. It's probably also something that I should really seriously consider rereading too. Next, we have Seinfeldia, which is basically a history about how Seinfeld, the TV series, was developed and created. I really, really love this show. It's probably one of my favorite TV shows of all time. So this was a really great behind the scenes look into how this thing actually got off the ground and started. There's not a ton of like tangible writing advice in there, but it's just really fascinating to learn from the processes that other creatives go through. So I'm going to put it in the B category there. Next, we have All of the Marvels by Douglas Wolk, which basically is a really interesting book because Wolk pretty much read through like every Marvel book in existence and then tried to synthesize them into one cohesive story. It's this really cool deep dive into the world of the Marvel comics, basically. So I'm going to put it up here. Next, we have Amazing, Fantastic, Incredible, which is Stan Lee's autobiographical comic memoir. It's basically a comic of his life. I really love this. It was so like charming. I feel like he's an inspirational figure to me in just the emotion that he was able to infuse in his stories and his ability to create characters that still resonate with us. Characters like, Spider-Man, Iron Man, these characters that decades after their creation are still resonant and interesting to explore. And the ending of this book in particular, where he's sort of reflecting back on how his younger self would see the man he has become, was really, really moving and powerful for me. And I actually cried at the end of this book, which is very rare. There's probably been maybe like 10 books I've read in my life that have made me cry, and this was one of them. Next, we have A Marvellous Life, which takes a little bit more of an impartial look at Stan Lee's life. The previous book is written from Stan Lee's perspective, so he's obviously going to be the hero in that. In A Marvellous Life, they talk about some of the things he did, which you could argue were maybe not that great. Like, he definitely did love to take credit for a lot of the characters that were possibly co-created by him and other artists. But still, this book really makes you admire the man he was and the company that he kind of built, and also the characters and the stories that he wrote. So I'm going to put that in the A category as well. Very, very great biography, and it's just fascinating to kind of learn more about a figure like this who has shaped so much of our sort of modern pop culture landscape. Next, we have Steal Like an Artist, which is basically about the right and wrong ways to steal from other people's work, and how it's not about copying or imitation, but it's about inspiration and homage instead. This is a book that I've heard people talk about for years, and people talk about it in such glowing terms that my expectations were very high, but it actually exceeded them. It's a very short book. It's a really easy read, but it's a great reminder about what matters when it comes to writing. So I'm going to put that up here. Next, we have Action by Robert McKee, and I've praised a lot of Robert McKee's other stuff. This book just didn't quite do it for me in the same way. Like, it's still an okay book, but it just felt like there wasn't as much interesting territory here that he was covering. It's basically a book about how to write better action stories. And while there are some useful things here, it just didn't feel like it got those same epiphany moments as he unlocked in books like Story or books like Dialogue or Character. So I think I'm gonna have to put it probably here. And then lastly, we have On Writing, which is Stephen King's memoir on his life as a writer. This is a book I've read twice. It's probably one of the only books on this list that I have read twice. The other ones being some of the Game Maker's Companion and Apprentice books, just because those are manuals that I needed to reread. The most useful thing I learned from this is that whole idea that writing and life, you really need to make sure you're focusing on the life, and that you don't want to have your life set up just to support your art, but it's important to use writing as a way to live a more meaningful and impactful life. And this is actually a realization that I sort of came to when I did a 30-day challenge where I wrote like Stephen King for 30 days. And that was such an impactful experience for me because it allowed me to really make a bunch of progress on my book, Kingdom of Dragons, that I was writing at the time. And I was sort of following the writing methods that Stephen King was talking about in this book here on writing. So in terms of all of these books here, if I was to assess which one is my absolute favorite out of these here, I would probably say that this order is fairly accurate. I think Story is the one that was probably the most impactful for me, and one that I regularly will go back and just revisit a few pages from. I've got a lot of markers in there as well. But all of these books, you know, have been really useful and pivotal for shaping me as a writer. So thanks for coming along this journey with me. I'd love to know in the comments down below, what are some of your most impactful or your favorite writing advice books that you've read? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.